Before you start this episode, this is just a reminder that History Hack does have a Patreon account and a Ko-fi account as well. You can either register to subscribe and throw us a few quid every month, or simply buy us enough caffeine to continue through to the next episode, because frankly, we run on fumes most of the time.
Hello and welcome back to History Hack, where we thought we'd throw out another episode. Alex, who have we got today?
Today, I'm really excited today. So last year we did a competition, the Great War Group, for conference, for people to hit us with something interesting, and an article, and it would be in the magazine, and they would get a free trip to conference. And our winner is with us today, renowned Great War Group reprobate, Louise Provan, who won the competition, in stunning style with, Dunsterforce, which is possibly one of the most bonkers escapades of the First World War. Louise, hello.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Did you think when you were writing the article that you'd win?
No, because it was one of these things, when I first read about it, I thought it was like some sort of boy's own story, somebody had made it up. It just sounded so unrealistic, and as read more and more into it, no one had heard of it. So I thought, it's just going to be really obscure. I'll never win this competition. This is completely obscure, but I love it, so I'm going to go with it. Yeah. Set in Azerbaijan, I couldn't even spell that when I first started.
You were literally the only person in the world that has got Baku at the top of their holiday destinations list.
I do. Yes, I do. Yeah.
And then you have epically fallen down this rabbit hole, and you're just refusing to come out now, aren't you?
I am. It's sort of turned into a bit of an obsession, trying to trace the officers who served with Dunsterforce in 1918, from a start point of having no names. I now have about 235.
Also as well. Yeah. It's now a Great War Group drinking game that when Louise starts about Dunsterforce, you have to drink. And it's never very long before that.
Yeah, it's very predictable.
Okay, so let's go on. You speak.
I was going to say, while we're in Mons, this probably should come out as an intervention and an admission. On the Saturday when we were going round and we were looking at all the different parts of the battlefield, the second most spoken about battle that day was Jutland, and that was mainly Louise on the bus. So
yeah, but I think did we not have to do a forfeit because of that?
Yeah, I think that was on the charge sheet.
Yeah, I think you did for talking about Jutland. I had to do one just for being me.
Bless. Right, okay, so if for people sitting there wondering what is Dunsterforce and what are these morons talking about, let's frame it up for them. So Louise, what's going on during the First World War on the northwest frontier of sort of India / what is now Pakistan, and Persian border?
Well, Persia's probably the most pertinent one in that the Great Game had been played out between Britain and Russia over the previous century. So Persia was all important as this sort of strategic post to India, the jewel in the British Empire crown. So any threat to India was really seen as, it was just a no-no. The British were always going to be reacting to that. And as the war started, the German Kaiser had intimated he was wanting to raise the armies of Islam against the British, and of course that made the British really nervous about what was going to happen in India. Kaiser obviously Germany had a lot of influence in the Ottoman Empire. They'd been investing in the railways there. They'd had a military mission out there training soldiers. Churchill hadn't covered himself in glory, the Ottomans, by promising to build them 2 battleships and then not letting them have these ships. So the Ottomans had sided with the Germans. So from British point of view, you had the Germans and Ottomans sort of as a threat on that side, and you had their allies, the Russians, slowly dissolving into chaos during the Russian Revolution. So you had this area of Persia and Azerbaijan, which was almost like a power vacuum. What Azerbaijan and Persia have was oil. So initially, all of the attention was on India and the threat to India and the jewel in the crown. Then latterly, the importance of oil. As the war went on, it became a war from coal-fired battleships and steam trains right through mechanization, tanks and planes and oil-fired ships. So these oil-fired ships were something that was pushed by Churchill and Jackie Fisher. But the problem being, Britain didn't have any oil. We got coal by the ton, but we didn't have any oil at that time. And so Churchill, he's quite often ahead of his game. He wasn't always right, but he was often ahead of his game. He managed to secure a controlling share in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. So that secured a supply of oil. So as the Turks and the Germans were encroaching on that area, obviously, the British were frightened that they were going to lose this source of oil as well. And they wanted to prevent the Turks and the Germans from securing it for their own purposes. There was also the Berlin-Baghdad Railway.
It was an obsession, wasn't it?
It was an obsession. This Berlin-Baghdad Railway, which is Germany again infiltrating an area which was known to have a lot of oil. So yeah.
Go on.
So from that perspective, Persia was very important. Northwest frontier, maybe slightly less so at that time. Afghanistan was this buffer type area between Asia and India. The Germans did try and sort of buy their way into Afghanistan. They sort of made the Emir of Afghanistan an offer if he would raise an army and fight the British in India. But the Emir was quite wily. He said he'd only do it if the Germans could supply him with 20,000 troops. And obviously that wasn't going to happen, because how would you get 20,000 troops across Asia to Afghanistan? You certainly weren't going to be able to go by sea, because Britain was pretty well had that base all covered. So the Germans were a wee bit maybe unrealistic in their aims there. Britain had been playing out the great game for the best part of a century, so they had the resources, they had no shortage of gold, they had people on the ground who were experienced, and the Germans were newcomers to this.
Just, you have mentioned there, and this is one of the reasons you won the competition, because yes, it was a nuts boys' own story, but the oil thing, one of the judges picked up that this is actually a really unique way of looking at the First World War, and sort of people haven't really paid attention before, is to start looking at minerals and their importance and fighting over them. Yeah,
definitely. And just resources in general. Another was cotton in the area, cotton being a key ingredient in cordite. So they were trying, if not get the cotton for themselves, just making sure the Germans can't get it. So yeah, I think that's what I found was very fascinating about it. Even though it was sort of an adventure story, it's very pertinent with the geopolitical situation I found so fascinating about it.
They got this idea to send a force in, don't they?
Yeah,
and it's under General Lionel Dunsterforce.
That's right. It was a small volunteer force that was raised in the last year of the Great War to carry out what was a sort of secret special operation in Transcaucasia. And Dunsterforce, well, it took its name from Dunsterville, as you said. He was a very interesting character. He'd been at school with Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling even immortalized him in a set of stories, Storky and Co., when they were at school together. And this is the United Services College at Westward Ho, which was set up for children who were destined to go to the army, but these are children of parents who couldn't afford to send their kids to the Harrows and Eatons. So, Storky and Co. And these stories, it's they're very different from the usual genre of boarding school literature, in that a lot of it was about exacting revenge on your enemies and, setting your enemies against each other in a revenge, and in some quite horrible ways. And sometimes Alex won't forgive me for this, but at one point they shoot a cat and nail it under the floorboards of an opposing dormitory. It's things like that. I mean, it's really quite brutal for children. Where Storky got his name from, his nickname, is that Dunsterville's nickname Storky, is that every school has its own slang and words to mean various nicknames. Storky meant conniving and clever and wily. So these were where he said later in life he didn't think he was half as stalky as his name would suggest, but his traits of being clever and wily were very, very useful on the northwestern frontier, where you were never quite sure who was friend and who was foe at any one time. So yeah, after Westward Ho, he went on to Sandhurst, and then he was posted to the northwestern frontier until the war broke out in 1914. Then he was sent to France. Much to his annoyance, he was put on train directing duties in France. He really thought he should be leading the troops over the top, but he was actually heading towards his 50s at that point anyway, so he probably wouldn't have been leading anyone over the top. So he was there for about a year, then sent back to the northwest frontier, and then Christmas 1917, he was told to report to Delhi to receive new orders. And these were his orders to lead a small force through Persia to Azerbaijan to secure the oil fields of Baku. And at that time, it was a very, very secret operation. So the force, they're all volunteers. They've volunteered for different reasons. One said he'd been through Passchendaele and anything was better for that than that. Another had fell out with his commanding officer, decided he'd volunteer. They all volunteered, not knowing where they were going. At the time, it was so secret. They were christened the Hush Hush Army amongst their contemporaries. Eventually, they were all gathered in London, received their kit, which included sun goggles and mosquito nets and snow boots and gloves. So that gave them no clue either as to where they were going. And they did find out on the eve of their departure where they were being sent to. The advertising blurb is quite good. It's very much like I think I've seen something like Shackleton had put in the newspaper looking for volunteers, and it was, "Gentlemen, are you prepared to undertake a desperate venture which will probably cost you your lives, but if successful will mean everything at this stage of the war to the British Empire?" So it's very much, yeah, you're going to die, sign me up kind of thing.
So it is 1,300 miles from Baghdad to Baku. And I'm guessing there was no motorway.
No, and that wasn't even the start of it. They actually took Dunsterforce himself had gone straight from Delhi overland to Baghdad. Others had come from Mesopotamia, or from already there in Baghdad. But the majority of the troops were actually met up in London, and they took a ship all the way around the long way through the Suez, through the Med, through the Suez. So they're at sea for quite a long time. Eventually, Dunsterforce decided he'd set off early. He set off in the January, and others followed in dribs and drabs afterwards. But as the route was through Persia or Iran, as we know it now, through Kermanshah, Hamadan, Risht to Enzeli on the Caspian Sea, with a view to taking a boat from Enzeli to Baku. So that was the route. He estimated it was going to take 12 days. So they set off in Model T Fords with a Lewis gun, a few supplies and a lot of gold, and off they went. Had a couple of, the 12 days just went straight out the window. The roads were terrible. The mountain passes, they had to go over one pass, which was over 7,500 feet. They were snowed in twice, once for a week. Spent a lot of time digging the cars out of snowdrifts. So eventually they reached Kazvan, just before Enzeli, and then found that sort of seat of anti-British resistance under Mirza Kuchik Khan, who's leader of the local Jangali tribe. So at that point, they pretty much about turned and went back down the road to Hamadan for a while to gather strength. So Dunsterforce's estimated 12 days was just, that would have taken him into late January, February. In reality, I don't think they didn't get to Enzeli till about June. By the time, they'd all gathered together and got sufficient reinforcements.
So what kind of advantages and disadvantages did he have in his force? Because obviously resupply is a long way, but he must have had something going for him when they arrived.
I think as the British had been in Persia for such a long time, it wasn't quite as isolated. There were post offices, there were banks, there were people who'd been, Americans and British who'd been working out there. So it wasn't entirely isolated. One of the problems he did have was the commanding officers in Baghdad. One of them thought that he should be Dunsterville shouldn't have an independent command, so he should be under his command. So he was kind of a bit obstructive. So the advantage, and Dunsterville himself, he got on well with local people. He spoke 7 different languages. And he also had a very effective system of spies as well, his own intelligence agents who were able to intercept trouble as it came along. So yeah, he did have that advantage. But his disadvantage was it was very, very small force. At one point, his Russian ally, Lazar Bisharikov, had shown up and scared off the Jengali. But when Bisharikov moved north with his Russian forces, Kuchik Khan and the Jengali saw their opportunity and ambushed a small detachment of Dunsterville's force, and that's where Robert Durford was killed, who was an old Etonian. Alex put me onto that. I presumably you saw that as part when you were doing your Etonian research.
I did. His brother's in my book, and I couldn't fit Persia into the book. Did you go and look?
Yeah. I kind of read the letters sort of backwards. So first letters I saw were, the family writing to each other saying, "Oh, this is terrible, Robert's dead." And then from the chaplain to the family. And then I started reading the letters that he'd written home for that. And suddenly all of a sudden it was quite dusty in the archive.
Yeah. He's the baby of the family, isn't he?
He's
from what I remember.
The family, so
And his brother had been killed at Hooger in 15, so.
That's right. Yeah. So he was another one. And then another family member was captured. It was a prisoner of war.
Yeah. He's one of the, tunnelers of Holzminden. He's the one who wrote the book about it.
Yeah. So that was very interesting.
Okay. So how does the situation look at Enzeli, when they begin?
Not great. He gets to Enzeli and finds it a Bolshevik stronghold. So, and the committee in Enzeli had received orders from the committee in Baku to arrest Dunsterville. So at that point, Dunsterville turns around and gets out of Dodge, runs. He eventually, after a few weeks, he makes his way back. And somehow he managed to, one of his intelligence agents obtains a letter proving that Kuchik Khan had been working in cahoots with the committee, and Kuchik Khan who'd killed this soldier officer of Dunsterville. So Dunsterville had the committee in Enzeli all arrested and thrown into the prison. Prior to that, Dunsterville had actually negotiated a swap for the Bolshevik committee wanted cars. Dunsterville was desperate for petrol, so he negotiated a swap some of his cars for petrol. By that time, he'd thrown them all in the committee, got his petrol and kept his cars. So very stalky. When he got to Enzeli, his next task was to get across to Baku, and he managed to obtain the use of a ship, the President Kruger, and from there, took off to Baku.
We've talked about soldiers enough. Let's talk about the Kruger. Let's talk more about ships.
No, you boaty nerds. No.
Yeah.
There is a time of boaty nerdery, Chris, and this is not it.
Oh dear, that's so predictable. The President Kruger, it was part of the British Caspian Flotilla, who was sent there in 1918, mainly to secure, this is completely out of Dunsterforce really, but this was to secure Krasnovodsk, which is on the other side of the Caspian Sea from Baku. And it was to secure that town against the Bolsheviks, and that was part of what was called the Malison mission, who the famous spy T. Jones was attached to. This is all to counteract the rising threat of Bolshevism. Dunsterville was very much counteracting the threat of the Germans and the Turks more so than Bolsheviks, whereas this was a new threat which was appearing now that the British government had to take cognizance of. Don't know why it was called the President Kruger, but it was. When Dunsterville got onto the ship, he there was a bit of a hoo-ha about what flag it was going to be sailing under, because there's no way Dunsterville was going to sail under a Bolshevik revolutionary flag. He couldn't put up the Russian flag because that would upset any other Bolsheviks around. So he reached this compromise, which was to fly the Russian flag upside down, which, unbeknown to loads of just about everyone else, that's actually pretty close to the Serbian flag.
Yeah.
So, yes. So Teague Jones actually made this pithy comment. Bear with me here, but you had a British general on the Caspian Sea sailing from a Persian port on board a ship named after a South African Boer president of German descent under a Serbian flag to assist a body of Armenians in a revolutionary Russian town against the Turks. So, yeah, has everyone got that?
It sounds perfectly reasonable.
Yeah. So the situation was quite complex.
So what happens when they get to Baku on the 17th of August?
They get to Baku, and the first thing they need to do is to start training the local Armenian troops to defend the town. That was Dunsterforce itself was small. No, I've never found an exact number, but I think estimates have put it somewhere just under 1,000. So Dunsterforce was very small. They needed the help from the locals, and so they start training them, equipping them, feeding them as well, because Persia and Baku, that area, had been racked by famine over the prior 2 years. But it turned out that these Armenian troops were just hopeless. They used to just turn about and run. If they didn't agree with the decision, they didn't feel personally bound by it. So even in the middle of fighting, they would actually sit down and have a committee decision about
this is a
something.
very post-revolutionary Russian thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So it was the Turks were gradually encroaching on the town. Eventually, when they did attack, Dunsterforce did kept holding them off. But at the final, on the very end of what they could do, Dunsterville had to go to what was called the dictators, the 5 dictators who were in charge of the town, and say, look, I advise you to make peace with the Turks, and we're out of here, mate. We've done all we can, so that was that, really.
Yeah, because in every good sort of commando movie or war movie I've ever seen, the small plucky force turn up, they train the locals and they repel the vicious enemy.
Yeah.
But like you said, the Ottomans come on in quite way. How badly does the fighting go? I mean, obviously very badly, but. I
mean, out of the 235 officers whose names I can sort of, guarantee who were with Dunsterforce, I can't remember. I calculated it was something like 22. I've got it written down. 22% died out of those. I mean, not all through the fighting. There's a whole range of exotic illnesses that they came down with on the way there. But the fighting didn't go well. Dunsterforce did lose a lot of its troops, and the locals just turned and fled. One of the issues for the local towns when the 5 dictators didn't see this coming. So they were absolutely shocked, gobsmacked, when Dunsterville said, sorry, I'm out of here, boarded the Kruger, and the dictators had them fired on the Kruger, but they managed to escape.
In terms of fighting, what does it look like compared to the Western Front?
In town, I don't know what you call it. It's more Stalingrad, I would think.
Yeah.
It's more Stalingrad. It was certainly building to building fighting. Yeah. At one point, Dunsterville's in the Hotel de Europe, and it's getting shelled very, very, very heavily. And this is really strange. It's almost as though they know we're here. So when that building's obliterated, he moves to a next building, another one. That's shelled. And this is odd. And it was only after the conflict, I think it was Rawlinson who'd been speaking to this Turkish colonel and said, a Turkish colonel had said to him, do you remember that Turkmenistan guy who used to sell you your feed for your mules? That was me. So Dunsterville's spies didn't always get it right.
Yeah, it was pretty epic.
Yeah. But the other thing, when all this fighting's going on, Lieutenant Alfred Rawlinson, who's the younger brother of the more famous Rawlinson, he manages to obtain a ship called the Armenian. And what he does there is try and clear as much ammunition, arms, anything like bombs, anything like that away onto the ship to take it away from the Turks to stop it falling into the Turkish hands. So, and he's actually awarded the DSO for his actions at the end, because he had a Russian captain of his ship who was a Russian captain and crew who were not helpful, to put it mildly. So what he did was build up a barricade of all these crates of ammunition, set the fuses and everything so it was all live. And he pointed out to the Russian crew, one bullet would take out not only the explosives, it would take out the ship and it would take out everyone to Kingdom Come. And so he managed to make them comply and sailed away with all this ammunition, basically a gigantic floating bomb, and for which he received DSO.
I just love this. There's so many anecdotes in that. What's your favourite? What's the one where you're like, come on?
Oh, another really good one. Yeah, it just occurred to me. At some point, Dunsterville had backups from planes sent from Baghdad, and of course Persians, they'd never seen the like, these planes flying overhead. He didn't have anyone shot or strafed by the planes. He just used them for maximum fear effect. But at one point, one of the pilots landed, and he immediately found himself surrounded by these Persian women who were ripping lumps off their own clothes. And what it transpired was that it's because he's wearing shorts, the Persian women thought that there was a cloth shortage, so they were going to repair his shorts for him and make trousers. Yeah, so that was quite a good one as well. I've forgotten his name. I'll have to look that up.
There's so many characters. Is there one that you are completely in love with?
Probably Rawlinson. I mean, he'd been injured on the Western Front in 1915, injured by a shell, went back home to recover. And then he'd been actually promoted to be colonel when he was on the Western Front by John French. But when he was recovering, he got told he couldn't be a colonel because whatever process they'd used to promote him wasn't the right one. So he wasn't entitled to be a colonel. So he went in a right strop, left the army and went to the Admiralty and said, look, here I am, I'm volunteering. He was put on air raid safety and Zeppelin prevention in London.
He writes the book, doesn't he, about the defence of London?
That's the one. Yeah, that's it. And then he gets bored, and so he actually volunteers again, writing this ardent desire to get right back in the action. He was bored. He wanted to, take it to the enemy. So he was quite a character.
It must be hard as well, coming from that family where dad was really high up. Your
older brothers
bossing an army. So following the fall and evacuation of Dunsterforce's adventures, come to an end, haven't they? Have they?
They do.
How would you evaluate their operation?
Percy Sykes, South Persia Rifles, actually said, he did a valuable thing. He stopped the Turks and the Germans getting the oil in the last weeks of the war. But overall, I think it was an opportunity missed. If there'd been more troops, they could have seized Baku, held on to it a bit longer, even permanently. But as it was, it became absorbed in Bolshevik Russia by about 1920. So I think it was probably a bit of an opportunity missed, really. And because, it's one of these things where they did have to retreat. So it was never going to be a sort of real success story. As it was, the Turks had sued for peace, just over a month later anyway.
I think because the Germans were still fighting in that area for quite some time. There was German detachments all over the place. I think they ended up in Azerbaijan.
There was also a lot of prisoners of war moving about in the place. There's a lot of prisoners of war out there as well. German and Hungarian.
Trying to find their way home by starting another war.
Yes. I think one of the things Dunsterville did accomplish was on his way through Persia. One thing he did notice were a lot of bodies at the side of the road. It was the place was absolutely racked by famine. So what he did was to start famine alleviation works. Quite a lot of his volunteers were South African, Australian, Canadians. They all had farming backgrounds. So he'd had a butchery set up, bakery, digging wells. So in that respect, I think he won the Battle of Hearts and Minds.
He's quite a likeable character, isn't he?
He was a very likeable character. He liked people. He didn't have this attitude that the locals were lesser people than the British or anything like that. Even Kuchik Khan, who previously ambushed him, became his main supplier of rice. So yeah, he just had a way with people, I think. He was also life and soul of the party. He liked to party. There are various accounts of him, at 3 a.m. singing very bawdy songs, and the hosts and hostess of the party thinking, how are we going to get rid of him? So, yeah.
Which leads me to give everyone the cocktail recipe, because you handed these out at 11 in the morning at the Great War Group conference.
Yeah.
What was it?
In my defence, Lockie started earlier than I did.
He did do an martini at 9 o'clock.
8 a.m.
Yeah.
Well, this was on the boat journey on the way round, through the Med, through Suez, and up through up Persian Gulf, and the officers had a chance to do sightseeing. They did quite a lot of drinking, and Singapore Stingers was the drink of choice, which one of the Great War Group members described as being a cross between, I think it was Murray Mint, Fairy Liquid, and Screen Wash.
I did 3 of them with Andy, so not complaining.
Which was maybe the box said drink them.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, it went down very well.
It went down very well, so it was kind of like listening.
I got my eyes out for lunch.
Well, I had a load left over, so I poured them away down the drain. I'm fairly sure the hotel in Chester doesn't have blocked drains anymore.
Right. Louise, assuming your other half isn't listening to this interview, where is all this research leading?
This research is now leading me conveniently to the Imperial War Museum in August. I was making the most of another event there. Also to Kipling Archives, which are down near Brighton. So things have been quite convenient. Coming from Scotland, none of these things are a day trip. That's the big problem I'm finding. It's, talking at least 3 days off work and not inconsiderable amount of money. And then hopefully next year, Baku, who I think I've managed to persuade one of the Great War Group members to come along with me, because he is convinced I'm going to get myself killed.
He'll agree to anything after. And frankly, having seen him in the desert, he's more likely to come to grief than you are.
I thought that.
You're going to end up babysitting him. But hopefully at the other end of this, a book.
Well, I would love to, but
I'm telling you, you're going to do a book. Like, I'm going to stand over you and point at you.
Vanda Wilcox said something similar.
Yeah, we're just going to stand over you and point at you till you do it. And Vanda has a very good stern face, because I've seen her use it on her little girl.
Yeah, I will have to take them.
Louise, thanks so much for coming in to talk about your competition winning work. And I'm not remotely sorry that you're now stuck down this rabbit hole, and it's taking...
Oh yeah, there's no chance of me ever coming out of this rabbit hole. I don't think what I have found, and I have to say, is that people have been very, very generous. People who've heard about research. I've had when some complete stranger contacts you on Twitter, you can be a bit, oh my goodness, who is this? But for the most part, I've had people contact me saying, so-and-so, my aunt has the diary, and, this kind of thing. So for the most part, I've had, so very generous, offers of help from people.
Yeah, I think we should say, if there is anyone listening who has any familial contacts with Dunsterforce, because it is hard to pin down a list of exactly who was with it, if you know that your people were there, contact Louise.
Oh yeah, that would be lovely.
She will never leave you alone again.
I'll be your friend for life.
Yeah.
Free Singapore Stingers at the bar.
Yes, absolutely. Louise, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/historyhack or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.